Welcome everyone to this webinar, which is hosted by the International Institute for Sustainable Development, the IISD, the International Chamber of Commerce, the ICC, and the PEW Charitable Trusts. This session is of course also a side event to the World Economic Forum's MC 2020 event, so a special thanks to the forum for the opportunity to include this discussion in that agenda as well. My name's Alice Tipping and I lead the work at on Fisheries Subsidies at the IISD. And before we move to the substance of the discussion, a quick reminder, because as they say on airplanes, every time is slightly different. We've promoted you all to panelists from attendees, which means you can see everybody else on the call, which we think is important. We're going to be recording this webinar. We'd ask you not to, that would be our preference. And we may be posting it on the website. I will mute everybody's microphones before we start, just to make sure that we don't have too much background noise as we go along. And of course, there'll be a little bit of time at the end for discussion, or at least more time for discussion. Many of you will be familiar with this already. If you'd like to participate, please raise your hand. You'll see that at the bottom of your participant box. If you have questions that come up as we go through the presentations, you don't need to scribble them all down immediately. You can start writing them up in the Q&A box, and we'll have that sight of that when we get to the end of the presentations. So with the housekeeping perhaps finished, our conversation this afternoon really tackles the question of new rules on fisheries subsidies that are under discussion at the World Trade Organization. And our aim essentially is to explore how leaders in various sectors can use the trade system to agree rules that deliver better outcomes for people, particularly those who are most dependent on fishing, and for the health of the world's ocean. Now, many of you will be aware that governments have been negotiating rules on fisheries subsidies at the WTO for almost 20 years, since the original Doha round of negotiations was launched. The issue, I think, was given new prominence in 2015, when the UN Sustainable Development Goals specifically signaled it out in Target 14.6, which calls for the prohibition of subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, and the elimination of subsidies that contribute to IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, by the end of 2020, that's this year. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has obviously slowed negotiations, as it has a lot of other multilateral work, but the chair of these negotiations has very recently released a consolidated text of an agreement for negotiators to work with, and governments still seem to be committed to concluding a deal by December this year. So while a deal, it seems, has never been more likely, what's crucial is that it delivers a meaningful outcome. And what will make a difference there is leadership from trade and from fisheries ministers, from the chair of the negotiations and other ambassadors in Geneva, and from civil society and people on the call today. So the other point to make is that nominations close today for the position of the new Director General of the WTO. There's obviously real potential for the incoming DG, whoever he or she may be, to exercise real leadership to craft a deal. Now, we're delighted to be joined today by three leaders in the fields of science, of business, and of trade policy, who we've invited to give their perspectives on why this agreement is so important and what it will take to get a deal that actually delivers. So by way of very brief introduction, we'll hear first from Dr. Daniel Pauly, who is a fisheries biologist and Killam Professor at the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries at the University of British Columbia, and is an authority on global fisheries. We've asked him to give us an overview of the state of the world's fisheries in historical perspective and the environmental imperative of subsidy reform. I'll then hand the floor to John Denton, who's the Secretary-General of the International Chamber of Commerce, the World Business Organization, which acts as the institutional representative of more than 45 million companies in over 100 countries. And we've invited him essentially to spell out for us the business case for this agreement. Why is it so important from a private sector perspective? And I'll then pass the floor to Pascal Lamy, who many of you in the trade community will be very familiar with. Monsieur Lamy was the Director General of the WTO between 2005 and 2013, and he's now President Emeritus of the Institut Jacques Delors. We've asked him to give his perspective, informed by long experience of trade policy making, of what will be needed to get a good deal over the line. So, Professor Pauly, I have your slides here. If you'd like to just let me know when you'd like to move on, I will begin your presentation. Here it is.
All right. There are different ways to express fishing effort. First slide, there are different ways to express fishing effort. And one of them is to put together, to add the power of all engines together. And if you do that, and we have done that several times now, Asia comes out as the major power in fisheries, literally. And Europe, in spite of attempt to regulate effort and to reduce it, continues to increase it. And if we projected this forward in the last years, it would continue. Next. This expansion of effort is actually occurring spatially. In the 50s, that's where Spain was fishing. And next. And this is where Spain now fish. You can do the same thing for South Korea, France, China, everywhere. And in fact, I would show you China next. China started in 1985 to expand in fisheries, and now, well, at least when it was done, this paper in 2014 it was published. They were in the waters of 93 countries, and only in the Caribbean and in North Atlantic did they not occur. In the meantime, they do occur in the Caribbean. So China is, we did this study for the EU Parliament, China is replacing lots of countries, and need I stress, their fleet is heavily subsidized. Next. We have a database of catches that is spatialized, that enables these processes to see this expansion process of fisheries, and it is based on the FAO data plus spatialization, and it allows us to do lots of things. See around us, we have also this effort. Next. And one of the things that we have been able to do is that the global catch, we have been able to show that the global catch is much higher than reported by the FAO, but is declining actually, because the FAO, because of IUU catches, doesn't report the total catch of the world. Illegal catches, catch of small fisheries, unreported catches are not included in the FAO database. Next. And if you include them all, you get another declining trend. And another way to show the expansion of fisheries, and it is nicer when you have this as a film, is to show where the fishery used the natural production of the sea in a significant way. This is red and orange here in the 50s. And next. And oh my gosh, two slides where.
Two slides, this one. Mm-hmm.
And this is how we are now. And needless to say, this process of expansion is fueled by subsidies. Now, if we go to the picture that was inserted at the wrong place, this is the real catch of the world is about 50% higher than reported by the FAO, and is declining rapidly. And is declining rapidly in spite of this massive increase of fishery, and in spite of this expansion, because the expansion essentially is this massive fleet. They flee from the places that they have devastated and have to get into new areas. It is very similar to a Ponzi scheme, and this they can do only because they have subsidies, because they could never go that far with the cost that it implies and earn their living otherwise, because they all competed for a dwindling resource. So basically, if we could get rid of subsidies, we would have to rebuild the stocks that were in the countries that were where the fisheries all started, if you like, and we would rebuild the stock, and they would actually make much more money than they actually do. Next. So, and the decline is contested by lots of people because they work on local fisheries and have a very small vision of these fisheries. But that actually you can analyze the decline using different methods. For example, the catch divided by the fleet effort, or other method that use the catch dynamic, and you get in any case you get massive declines in all areas of the world. This is not a fishery for given species. This adds fisheries for FAO regions, and overall they cover the world. And these are two different papers using two different methods showing the same thing. The decline in fishing effort is directly connected with how much money you make in your fleet, and they are losing their shirt, and the taxpayer is actually keeping these boats afloat. Next. The result of all of this is the process known as fishing the undermine food web. That is, I coined the term in '98 in a journal called Science. Basically, this fleet catch big fish when they for the first time are in a certain area. And I was, for example, I was in '75 as a young man involved in the introduction of trawling into Indonesia, and after a while you catch very small fish and you have modified the environment. So on top of the subsidization and the distortion of the market that it implies, you get the environmental community riled up for good reason, because you completely mess up marine ecosystem. Next. And the amount of subsidies, and they were estimated by the World Bank before and by the FAO, and these estimates have been largely replaced by estimates that my friend Rashid Soumaila and I and our collaborators produced. I'm sure Pascal Lamy remembers Rashid Soumaila because he was several times in Geneva, and together we have estimated subsidies of different types, and these numbers are now used, and they show that the capacity enhancing subsidies dominate, especially in Asia and also in Europe, whereas in the US, for example, these the management and safety subsidy, the positive beneficial subsidies dominate, and we also find that the industrial fisheries get a much bigger benefit, much bigger slice of the subsidies, whereas the small-scale fisheries, if you think that subsidies do a good thing, why not directing them at small fisheries which employ far more people and produce directly food for human food security, whereas large-scale fisheries actually feed into industrial market, including food for not human consumption. So that basically we know the subsidies. We have global subsidies estimate for the whole world. They are available on our website, and they impact on the expansion of fisheries is quite well documented. So the scientists have done their job, and it's now your job to do something with it. Thank you very much.
Super, thank you very much indeed, Professor Pauly. I think that's fantastic. I'm going to rapidly go back up to our very more general slide, and perhaps, I mean, John, I think it's been good to see business get engaged in these negotiations. And I think, as Professor Pauly said, the science is clear. You know, we can see that fisheries effort is increasing exponentially. We can see that despite this huge increase in fishing effort, catch is actually declining. So we're spending more time and more fuel and more time on the water to catch fewer and fewer fish, it seems. And we can also see that a lot of this is driven by subsidies. So I think that, you know, the science seems to be clear, and perhaps it's up to us as negotiators and as participants in the negotiations to work out what the next step is. But why is this important from a business perspective? At the end of the day, this is all about government's relationships with businesses, big and small. So what's your perspective? Why does this matter so much from a business perspective?
Thanks very much, Alice, and Professor Pauly, thanks very much for that presentation, and it's great to be here, particularly working also with Pascal. Frankly, I'm actually kind of here partly because I'm astounded that I have to be here. I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous that here we are, so many years in, that a problem with such a self-evident answer, which is the answer which has been committed to by so many governments and so many members, still seems to be turning itself into a wicked problem. It is actually a nonsense. From a business perspective, the business case is extremely clear. I mean, there's the environmental case, which Professor Pauly has laid out with great eloquence. There's a human and economic case. And frankly, there's a credibility case here. The credibility case goes to both the functioning of the multilateral trading system and actually the commitment that people say they have to the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, you actually have in fisheries the absurd situation where I actually heard Lighthizer, Ambassador Lighthizer say, with some merit, and it all comes down to fish. The credibility of the system actually relies upon people living up to the commitments they've made, because the actual case for movement on the fisheries subsidy agreement is actually self-evident, and people well understand it. And yet, negotiators and members in Geneva operate in dissonance to commitments made even by leaders. So you actually have the classic dysfunctionality here. Look, the ICC interested? Look, we are the institutional voice of 45 million businesses. We see a functioning multilateral trading system as critical. But don't forget, I mean, when we talk about 45 million businesses, a lot of these businesses are SMEs and micro SMEs. A lot of these micro SMEs and SMEs operate off the fishing food chain. They actually participants, or actually their villages or the businesses in which they run operate next to or reliant upon a functioning fisheries system. They're not the major beneficiaries, by the way, of subsidies, as we all know. In large-scale producers, the actual beneficiaries of this, small-scale producers are not. So, you know, we would say that there's a human and an economic business case which sits very comfortably with the environmental business case, which is, I understand, what everyone recognized, which is why there was such commitment to close this agreement. So we have a very clear, I think, motivation or a burning platform. What we lack is the burning ambition to close this. And that's where it's the failure of leadership, frankly. And that failure of leadership is best evidenced by the lack of credibility that is attached to the failure to close this, both for those involved in the multilateral trading system, particularly ambassadors in Geneva, particularly headquarters who are actually arguing with them still, despite the commitments being given at a political leadership level. So there is a level of dysfunctionality here. And so the failure of leadership to actually create a burning ambition to close this is really important. And look, frankly, how can we be serious about the commitments made by leaders to closing and supporting action on the 2030 agenda, when target 14.6 states that governments must prohibit certain forms of fisheries which contribute to overcapacity and overfishing? If that's not met, what does this say about government's actual ambition, I mean, and their actual credibility and support for and enforceability of SDGs? So it's actually fourfold from my perspective. It goes very much to the environmental issue, the economic and human issue, and then it goes to the credibility, both of the multilateral trading system and actually of leaders' commitments to Agenda 2030. And actually, even if you look at the multilateral trading system, and you articulated, Alice, that the nominations have now closed for the next DG. Look, when Roberto came in, everyone said that the low-hanging fruit was actually getting some action on the trade facilitation agreement. Frankly, for the incoming Director General, it should be like shooting fish in a barrel to close this, if you actually accept the truth of the statements and the affirmations made by leaders that they're committed to SDG, the 2030 goal, and that they're committed to an outcome here, which is what we've been told they've been committed to, and yet for some reason it keeps on being delayed. And failure to deliver here is a failure of the credibility. Success here, of course, which is where the burning ambition come from, is actually huge. These negotiations do matter, not just because we're interested in the multilateral trading system. We have millions of members who rely upon a functioning fisheries system for their livelihoods, and that's incredibly important. And look, and we know trade negotiations are never easy, but there's a lot at stake, as I said, for the environment, for workers, for the global economy, and for the credibility of the system, and for the survival of the trading system. And if we can get momentum behind the fisheries agreement to close it, as has been committed to, then it creates greater momentum to move on to other issues, which are actually equally important to ensuring the relevance of the WTO and the multilateral trading system. We do need to ensure that we have a full-blooded whack getting movement on the e-commerce negotiations and discussions. And I think maybe Pascal will talk about this. We may have different views about the timing, but actually we need to get the DG's focus, working with, at a political level, leaders to actually shift the discussion on the reform of the multilateral trading system itself and the WTO. We need this issue with. That should be an ambition. That should actually lead an ambition to close this thing. So you said you're going to do it, let's get it done, and we will hold you to account. And the reason the ICC is now involved, because we are now taking a view that failure to do so should actually have consequences, political consequences.
Okay, we'll get to the political consequences. I'm interested in this idea when we can, but that's perhaps the perfect segue to Monsieur Lamy. Monsieur Lamy, you're a friend of ocean action, right? I mean, you know the WTO and its politics better than almost anyone. What do you think needs to happen to get these negotiations over the line?
Well, thanks, Alice. I'll try to answer this question. Thanking you first for organizing the discussion, which I believe is both extremely necessary and timely. It's necessary, and we've just heard why it is necessary to urgently end overfishing, and what is one of the major causes with overfishing, which is overcapacity, which stems from fish subsidies, and it's very timely. Because I think we've never been so close to a result after 20 years. And I have good reasons to A, remember those 20 years, and B, have a look at where we are. The reason why I remember these 20 years is that I started these 20 years. I was the guy who, when we cooked the Doha round, insisted that fish subsidies disciplines should be part of the basket of 20 topics on which members of the WTO were to agree to launch a negotiation. And I can tell you that was a very tough battle because the reaction overall, the normal primary reaction was, what's this to do with trade? That's nothing to do with trade. It's about environment. It's about fish. It's about things which are in other remits of the international system. And as the EU trade negotiator at the time, it was already a time where the EU wanted to sort of green a bit the WTO and trade, and it has had more consequences later. So I finally got it in the name that, okay, it may not be a trade issue, but look, it is a subsidy issue. And there's one place in the international system which is serious about expertise, notification, monitoring, litigating about subsidies, which is WTO. So that was the argument that got the decision. And I must say at the time, I got a lot of support from the US and a lot of support with a large number of what in WTO we call middle grounders whether in Latin America, in Europe, and even some in Asia, although a bit less than other continents, but I'm not going to give names. Now, since then, a lot of water, not under the bridge, but under the boat. And I think the thing has matured, it has changed, it has cooked as a result of several evolutions, so that it is now in reasonably good shape for being served in the dining room of ministers. Now, the main elements that have changed is first, and I look again at the whole picture, that there is now what was totally absent at the beginning, a connection between the trade negotiators' little cluster and fish. No, the trade negotiators never really had a problem with fish because fish circulate along to their own will. They decide to go north, east, southwest, and trade negotiators can hardly influence these behaviors. The only area where trade negotiators had a very strong connection with fish was rules of origin, which is a typical question for an exam. If you pass an exam to become a trade negotiator, the question will be, what is the rule of origin of a fish? Is it the water in which it has been caught? Is it the nationality of the owner of the ship? Is it the color and the flag of the pavilion of the ship? Is it the port of disembarkation? And each of these answers has some merit. So that was the only way in which, let's recognize that it's a rather negative connection. It's changed because of a progressive familiarization. Then I think the major element was a much larger connection between what happens in WTO and what happens in other remits of the international system, including what you mentioned, Alice, a sort of more recent greening of the international agenda, hence of the WTO negotiations. And I know that, for instance, and you mentioned it, in the creation of SDG 14. I was one of the midwifers of this objective as a member of the Global Ocean Commission with other colleagues. So this is what has changed. And it has changed overall for the better. The issues are more seriously identified. The positions have been becoming more rational. Now, what needs to be done, and that's my final point, that's the very precise area of your question. I think success now hangs on two ingredients, which all seasoned negotiators will tell you at this stage of the process are essential, which is political will on the one side and technical solutions on the other side. And negotiations finish when this mix of political will and technical expertise obliges negotiators to reveal their real preferences. Trade negotiations are a long history of how you have to hide your real preferences until the moment there's no way you can behave otherwise than tabling your right preferences. I think we are nearing this point. Political will, I think, is there, not least because there's a credible deadline at the end of this year, not least because environment is now much higher on the international agenda, as we said, and I think COVID and the COVID crisis will reinforce this. The fact that COP26 had to be postponed, the fact that we have next year both COP26 and the biodiversity convention in China helps focusing minds. So I think the notion that political will is available is true. It simply needs to be pulled in a way that exercises constraints on the negotiators. On the technical solution side, and I don't want to enter into any specific technicalities, I think there are two major areas where solutions still need to be found. One is the distinction between harmful and non-harmful subsidies, and there's a host of details in there which still need to be fixed. And the second one is the famous special and differential treatment. I think there is a recognition that we need solid disciplines, but there's also recognition that small fishing capacities should be treated more favorably than big fishing capacity. And what we just heard from the professor also leads in this direction. So on the one side, we need some flexibility for small fishing capacities. On the other side, we need these flexibilities to be limited so that big fish does not go through the nets of the disciplines. So it's a problem of adjusting the stitches of the net of the discipline to the category of subsidy you need to catch. That's a typical fishing problem, but I think it's doable. I think you now have, with Santiago Will as a chair of the negotiating group, a seasoned expert and a guy who really wants to get things done. He has tabled last week a paper which is, of course, far from being the end point, but which I found relatively clever, and that really matters. So I think you have a good steer at the chair of the negotiating group, and I have no doubt that the next DG of WTO will be familiarized with this issue, and I'm sure IISD, PEW, the ICC, Global Subsidies Initiative, many of us will make sure that there are 1 or 2 questions next Thursday and Friday to the candidates DG of the WTO on fish subsidies. If I were to give one priority to IISD for the next week, make sure this question appears in the quiz for DGs next week.
Super. I have my homework for the next week. Thanks very much, Pascal. I mean, I think that's really useful wisdom, and I think if you can consider a chair's text relatively clever, that's pretty high praise for the chair. So well done him. Listen, that's the end of the formal interventions. So to all of you, you're all panelists and attendees. If you'd like to take the floor to ask questions, please raise your hand as you do in Zoom. If you're a bit shy, you can write that question into Q&A. That's just fine. And perhaps while we wait for some of the hands to appear or the questions to appear, I mean, I guess there's sort of a couple of things that I wanted to capture. And first, to come back to the questions that Professor Pauly was putting. And I think the graphs that you showed us for me illustrated a couple of 2 points. And the first is that for some fishing fleets, their activities span the globe. And for many different fishing fleets fishing in the same areas, they're probably competing with each other. And the second, your data was showing that even as effort is increasing, the size of stocks are declining. So we're putting more and more effort into this competition for the last remaining fish. And I guess my question is, doesn't this paint a classic and particularly urgent collective action problem? So perhaps sort of some thoughts on that would be useful. And this is, I think, sort of extra complicated in the WTO circumstance because of the special differential treatment point that Monsieur Lamy raised. And for those of you not, kind of deep in the WTO lingo, special and differential treatment is essentially different levels of obligations or different timelines that developing country members of the WTO can take on. And in this sense, fisheries subsidies, this negotiation is a bit of a microcosm of that problem, of the challenge of balancing rights and obligations, because in fisheries, like in many other areas of economic activity, the largest players are both developed and developing country members. And so which brings me back to this question of leadership. How do we galvanize leadership amongst the big players to solve this collective action problem? Because without them, it's going to be difficult. So I leave you with that kind of question. A couple of things in the chat, just to make sure that we capture them as well. Yes, a point from Ron Steenblick, which is quite right, is that we have in many cases data from governments or from estimates about the support that many governments, both in the OECD and outside, provide. So this shouldn't be a question of a lack of data necessarily holding us back. Okay, I mean, this is another, so perhaps can I ask you the question about galvanizing leadership of the big players? And then we have a really interesting one in the chat that I'll come to next. Perhaps Professor Pauly, would you like to go first? You deal with policymakers every day. How do you galvanize leadership to resolve these collective action problems?
If I may, I would answer another point that you made before that. You pointed out the need for developing countries to have another criteria to meet than the big countries, the big industrialized country. But within countries, within developing countries like India or Brazil, subsidies have the same effect, the same deleterious effect that they have on the international scene. For example, in Brazil, subsidies go to the industrial sector against the small-scale sector, and it impoverishes. It as the immediate result of impoverishing the fisher community. Same thing in India. India has built a huge fleet that has essentially always competing against the small-scale fishers because the oceanography of India around India is such that you cannot really fish in deep water because there is no oxygen in deep water, and so in India, around India, the fishery can only operate close inshore, and every time they launch a new trawler, they impoverish another group of small-scale fishers who actually can exploit the resource that are there, and yet it is India and Brazil which 10 years ago or so, Mr. Lamy will remember, caused the negotiation which were almost successful on getting rid of the subsidies to fail, because they said the subsidies in developing countries have a different effect than in industrialized countries, which is not true. They have the same devastating effect on the local community. And another point I was going to make is it's kind of strange that people have to be convinced that that fish enter in trade. Actually, fish is with coffee the most traded commodity in the world. The fish, essentially, most fish are not consumed where they are caught. They are consumed in other continents, and they share this with coffee. And another important commodity, rice, for example, is a very small amount is traded. Most of it is eaten where it is caught. It is not the case for fish. Fish are, the majority of it is transshipped between countries after it's been caught. So yeah.
So galvanizing leadership?
Galvanizing leadership.
What do you say to policymakers to minister to?
They are, with subsidies, they are doing the opposite of what they intend to do. With subsidies, they actually actively contribute to destroying the fishing community that they pretend to correct, to help. And it is very difficult even to convince them that with subsidies, you will increase the catch. Because in the 60s, in the 70s, when there were lots of resources to be caught offshore in other countries, in other seas, you could subsidize a fleet that would actually bring back fish. But now you can't. You will, with subsidies, you can only take what you can fight another in a fight, get another fleet to give to concede to you, basically because there is this enormous competition. So with subsidies, collectively we fish less and less, and no other sector of industry, Mr. Denton will will know about this perhaps. Fisheries have increasing yield when you increase fishing, but if you increase fishing further, the yield declines, and so the boats are not an input to production the way that money is an input for manufacturing, or machines are input, or land for agriculture. The boats are not making fish. The boat are just collecting fish that nature produce, and therefore, beyond a certain level, adding boats doesn't increase the catch; it decreases it. And at this point, it's very hard to get across. They think that the fishery scientists don't understand, but it's them who don't understand that fisheries are different from anything manufacturing, from agriculture, that the boats that are used for catching the fish are not an input for production. They are just the collecting device for production that nature produce. And it is very difficult to convince ministers that are maybe engineers or maybe agronomists that the system that they have learned, which is a positive response to increase input, doesn't apply to fisheries. That more boats will not generate more catch.
So that's the scientific argument.
It's so trivial, but it is, you cannot get that idea across.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think that's the scientific argument, and it's kind of a clear blind of an argument for me. John, we were talking about galvanizing political leadership. That's what the scientist would say, which I think is blindingly obvious. What's the business message? How do you speak to policymakers to galvanize the political leadership that this issue is going to take? And maybe I can bring you back to this idea of consequences that you raised earlier, because that's an interesting one.
Thanks very much. Possibly you gathered from my first intervention that one way you galvanize is actually by talking directly to them in very clear language about what it is we're grappling with here. But Pascal put it extremely well. I mean, this is the point, in a more sophisticated way that we need to balance here. There's, in every negotiation, you come down to the confluence of the political momentum and the technical momentum, but basically getting the stuff done, but you actually then need to push across. And of course, for political momentum, there's two aspects here. One is there's negative, in the sense that you hold people to account on the basis of hypocrisy, or you actually then create a positive narrative. Frankly, as Pascal says, there's actually a very, very compelling positive narrative for action here, which should be able to instill political capital to enable action to take place. I mean, the fact that China is hosting the biodiversity conference next year, this is there is key opportunity here for some common ground, or for some friendly opportunity here for a positive outcome built around this sort of issue. The fact that we've had a failed COP process this year and the delay, the fact that there will be a COP26 process next year, at least the Italians are trying to keep it moving. It gives an opportunity for the UK in its first major outing as an independent nation, although I thought it was an independent nation for a long time, though I'm an Australian, we probably speak like that a little bit, to actually make an imprint. And we actually have the Italians moving to the G20 position. So there is actually potentially a confluence of events. And as Pascal says, there's actually an increasing pressure for a proper discussion about trade and environmental issues. So all these things are happening. Plus, I must say, I should shout out to Ambassador Mills here from Colombia. I mean, for the first time, we've actually got a chair's text. You know, that is something.
There was one, but ages ago. Yeah.
One, but ages ago. But one that we can actually look at. And as Pascal would say, a clever text. So, you know, you've got the potential here for a positive narrative, which can create political momentum. Plus, you've got the room here, because of the quality of the text, to actually move things along in terms of the technical side as well. But in terms of hypocrisy, it's pretty clear. You know, nations that talk about the need to preserve the multilateral trading system and yet do not make the necessary compromise, which is not necessarily huge and is not necessarily an own goal. It's actually, when you listen to the professor, it's actually in their interest to shift there. And of course, you know, nations that speak on behalf of the global world in support of the SDGs and yet do nothing at a particular point in time when it's within their reach to do something on fisheries, there's clear hypocrisy, and of course the business community will call that out. One, we want a multilateral trading system that functions, and if you do not act, then you are actually part of the breach. Stop simply blaming Trump. You're actually part of this challenge to the functioning of the multilateral trading system, and this is an issue that's important. And of course, the incoming Director General. I mean, this needs to be, as Pascal said, and I think, as we all know, this has to be not the only issue, but how an incoming DG will grapple with this issue should be a litmus test for the quality of that DG and the ability of that DG to actually preserve the multilateral trading system.
No, very well said, and we'll see whether there are any very last-minute nominations. I think things close possibly in just a few minutes. Maybe Pascal, I'll come back to you with this question of kind of galvanizing political leadership, but there was a comment in the chat that I thought I'd bring into this too, because the question relates to the current context, right? And in the COVID-19 crisis, I mean, some countries are attempting to unlock themselves and return to sort of business as usual and managing the risks of that. Other countries are still in the throes of extremely steep infection curves and are still locked down and economic activity is suffering. I mean, how do you speak to policymakers about a long-term objective like this when their very immediate front-of-mind political priority is preserving employment and preserving incomes, including in fisheries? How do you speak to them to balance those objectives?
Yes, Alice, I will try and address this. But my first reaction is, if they listen to what Professor Pauly just said, this is not a long-term issue. This is a short-term, urgent issue which has a lot to do with providing food to poor people in 5, 10, 20, 30 years. So it's not a sort of, you know, it's not, we know the dangers of climate change, but, you know, the notion that the temperature will be 3 degrees 100 years from now, that's long-term. Fish depletion is something that hurts people in their stomach. And this is something which I think is short-term. Now, the how you mobilize political will, peer pressure, and domestic politics. Peer pressure does work. If the president of the US or the chair of the European Commission takes his or her phone and says, colleague, it would be good if, then whoop, the thing comes to this level. And in many countries, the notion that there is a fish subsidy negotiation WTO, I can tell you, is nowhere near the in-tray of the head of state or government. So just a colleague calling and said, hey, friend, have a look at that, can do a lot. Second, of course, there is the issue of domestic political pressure. And we know full well that fisheries political constituency, the fishermen, the French fishermen, are much better organized generally than the friend of fish. It's like farmers, they have a big political lever because they occupy a part of the country which is dense, where there are usually geopolitical issues, so they have a big political leverage. And there's no way they will not try to exercise this leverage. Anybody who's been dealing, for instance, with the Koreans on fish knows that these people are incredibly tough. And by the way, fishermen are usually incredibly tough because they have to be tough in the life they live to catch their fish. So the issue there is you have to balance this through mobilization of public opinion. And you have to mobilize the sort of emotional relationship which part of public opinion, including young people, have with oceans, with the sea, with nature, and with fish. I mean, fish is usually, so there is sort of empathy with fish. I mean, it's not always about sharks. It's about whales, it's about dolphins. Fish is usually something which is positive emotionally with public opinion. So, and this is, frankly speaking, this is the work of NGOs. This is the work of many people I work with in various continents that try to push this issue.
Mm-hmm.
True, COVID may give the impression that this massive sanitary economic crisis postpones more less urgent agendas. This is a danger. I'm among those in the European Union who so far have been fighting a lot to make sure that this Green Deal, this greening of the EU strategic agenda is not the victim of COVID. I think so far we've reasonably succeeded in using one basic argument, which is that this COVID crisis is also related to the economic model we have, and that needs to be made more sustainable, less fragile. We have to accelerate the ecology transition rather than slow it, and I think it's an argument that works. Finally, let me make one utopian suggestion, but which I've been thinking a lot of time about this issue, which is think of a situation where you have a community of fishermen. You give them a pot of money and you tell them, you get the pot of money and you decide how you are going to use this pot of money. My dream, but maybe it's a dream, is that if you do that, they will do the right thing. They will not compete with each other. They will organize themselves to deliberate.
Oh, Pascal, I'm afraid you're back. Are you back, Pascal? Good.
Yeah, yeah.
Super.
So that's my
the utopian vision.
That's my utopian vision, and I would like an experiment of this to be done by Professor Pauly and his colleagues, because I'm convinced it would give extremely interesting debates.
Super. Thank you very much indeed. Professor Pauly, I'm extremely sorry, but I'm afraid we're just out of time to continue with this. But I think there's a lot of really super messages that have come out of this discussion, I think, and the need for collective action, the fact that this is actually urgent. This isn't a topic for the next 20 years of discussion. This is a topic that needs to be finished this year. I'm looking forward to seeing some of the peer pressure that Pascal mentioned applied by people like John, Pascal yourself, Professor Pauly, when you're speaking to fisheries ministers and other leaders. And I think it's also incumbent on the rest of us, those of us in civil society, to make sure that the questions get asked of incoming WTO DG candidates, that they get asked of trade ministers, and that they get asked of trade officials and of fisheries experts who are advising those officials in the negotiations. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. I apologize for the delays at the beginning. Technology is what it is. But I'm extremely grateful also to Pascal, to John, and to Daniel for the extremely concise and extremely insightful messages that they've left us all with. So thank you very much, all of you, for your time. Thank you for joining us. For those of you returning to the forum's rest of day, I hope it's enjoyable, and I hope all of you, of course, in these uncertain times are all safe and well.